Cuba. From sugar to tourism. How does a country go from once depending on a food item to people traveling from all over the world? How did it happen? Why did it happen? How does it affect the people there? We'll find out.
Sugarcane is one of the most used products in the world. From 2019 to 2020, 171.69 million metric tons of sugar were consumed around the globe. An old saying is, without sugar, there is no country. An essential aspect of Cuban life for generations has been sugar. Sugarcane was first introduced to Cuba by Spanish colonizers in the 16th century. With Cuba's tropical climate and nutrient-rich soil, sugarcane can grow into a profitable industry for Cuba's economy, especially during the colonial period. Cuba saw sugar as an opportunity for economic potential and to become a market competitor. Cuba's location in the Caribbean made it simple to ship sugar to Europe and to the US, two of the world's largest markets at the time. In 1523, Spain planted sugarcane in Cuba, but it wasn't until the 18th century that Cuba became a popular country. Cuba was the world's biggest sugar producer by the 1880s and made up roughly 80% of Cuba's exports. Cuba fought for and won its independence from Spain in the late 1800s, but the sugar business remained intact. In the 1950s, the sugar industry was responsible for 85% of Cuba's foreign exchange profits and nearly 25% of the country's GDP. As a result of the new sugar mills and the redistribution of land to small farmers following the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the sugar industry underwent significant changes. In 1959, the USSR intervened and acquired 100% of the island's nation's sugar exports at guaranteed rates. The USSR agreed to temporarily purchase Cuban sugar and provide assistance in exchange for gasoline. The agreement was expected to contribute to the long-term success of the Cuban economy. Cuba was completely dependent on sugar exports due to only producing sugar at the expense of other agricultural industries. But then, Cuba's leading trading partner, the Soviet Union, fell apart in the 1990s, triggering a severe economic downturn known as the Special Period, and a drop in the country's sugar production. This shifted everything. Sugar, the sole income source for most of Cuba, led to detrimental effects on the civilians, particularly in terms of economic inequality, terrible working conditions, and government corruption. Because of their reliance on sugar exports, the price of sugar on the world market would frequently shift, which resulted in job insecurity, unstable income for most employed in the sugar business, and times when the whole economy itself struggled. Most Cubans lived in poverty due to the amount of land and wealth in the hands of a small number of corporations and owners of sugar plantations. African slaves made up the majority of the workers on the sugar plantations until it was abolished in 1886. Long hours, low pay, and dangerous working conditions such as pesticide exposure were typical for sugar plantation workers. There were few chances for economic growth due to the focus on sugar production, which restricted the amount of jobs available. Deforestation, soil erosion, and other environmental problems resulted from the excessive use of land for sugar plantations.
During Cuba's sugar period, Cuba maintained relations with countries such as the United States, Spain, and the Soviet Union. The booming sugar industry allowed Cuba to maintain trade relations with these countries, as Spanish investors were heavily involved in the sugar trade, and American investors acquired large plantations and established facilities on the island. The economic dependence on foreign markets led to Cuba becoming a major supplier of sugar to the United States. The close trade ties paved the way for significant American influence over Cuban affairs during the sugar period. These countries, such as Spain and the Soviet Union, were also major consumers of Cuban sugar and maintained trade relations with the island during the sugar period.
After the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, Cuba's economy suffered greatly as its leading trading partner and main source of income vanished. The Cuban government then started to focus on tourism as a way of reviving the nation's economy. The government invested in new hotel construction and infrastructure to draw tourists to Cuba's beaches, cultural landmarks, and natural attractions. The country appeals to travelers worldwide with its rich cultural past, stunning beaches, and tropical climate. Sugar plantations were converted into museums, and tourist destinations like Trinidad and Valle de los Ingenieros, Valley of the Sugar Mills, were given UNESCO Heritage Site status, making the region a natural tourist draw.
The Cuban government's legalization of the US dollar in 1993 also made it simpler for tourists to travel to and spend money in Cuba. Fidel Castro informed the workforce in the sugar business on October 21, 2002, that the government would be forced to drastically close down unproductive sugar mills. According to Fidel Castro's speech on October 21, 2002, only 71 of the 155 sugar mills would continue to operate, and between 58,000 to 60,000 layoffs were enforced. Communities around Cuba have become even poorer due to the following shutdown of over half of the active sugar mills. But then, Raul Castro started announcing new reforms in 2006, including the restructuring of industrial systems, the implementation of pay-for-performance wages, and further reducing the size of the government. The guidelines, unveiled on April 18, 2011, is a manifesto outlining 313 economic goals intended to restructure the Cuban economy substantially. The guidelines claim that they are guided by the principle that socialism is about equal rights and opportunities for all citizens, rather than egalitarianism. The adjustments the guidelines made, such as enabling private property and auto sales, allowing home renovations, and promoting pay-for-performance incentives in state-run companies, as well as leasing vacant land for food production, had a significant influence on Cuba. More than 400 homes offered travelers lodging and meals in exchange for money in 2015. Due to the financial inflow it has seen and the government's choice to direct funds to historic preservation, the city of Habana and other parts of Cuba had lots of constructions in a short period of time. Cuba's tourism industry rose quickly, and by 2019, it was the nation's most prominent source of income. Only 340,000 tourists visited Cuba in 1990, but by 2019, that number climbed to almost 4.2 million, making it one of the nation's most significant sources of income.
Tourism has allowed Cuba to grow not only economically, but also by allowing for Cuba to live down its stereotypes portrayed by other countries such as the U.S. Tourism in Cuba has had a huge impact on employment, with numbers reaching unprecedented levels. The sector has created approximately 100,000 jobs for Cubans, and this figure is expected to rise even further. Moreover, it is estimated that an additional 200,000 jobs will be generated in various sectors such as agriculture, light industry, communications, energy, and other tourism-related areas. The positive influence of tourism extends beyond formal employment, as it enables families to sell their own goods, including food, artwork, jewelry, and souvenirs. Some families even make a living by providing lodging and meals. This empowers individuals to become self-employed and creates more opportunities for them to provide for their families. Cuba is often portrayed in a bad light, people believing that untrue facts and stereotypes about those who live there.
Maybe just don't go to Cuba.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of really other good sites in the world that might be better options.
And these preconceived notions are caused by propaganda spread throughout countries like the U.S. But tourism has become a bridge for respectful relations between Cuba and other countries. As people from different nations visit Cuba, it opens doors for fostering international understanding and cooperation. Tourism can help break down these stereotypes, build connections, and strengthen bonds between people from different backgrounds. If it weren't for tourism, we wouldn't have met the people that we did. We wouldn't have known the true culture of Cuba any different from what we had been taught in the U.S. Now we can make sure that everyone sees Cuba the way we did. While tourism has showed promise of being a major part of economic growth, the negative impacts may take away from the potential of tourism. The biggest draw in traveling to Cuba is the exchange rate, ranging from 25 pesos to 180 pesos per U.S. dollar, which means that for U.S. travelers, everything is cheaper. But what people don't realize is that those prices aren't low for Cuban citizens, and because of tourism, the prices for everyday goods are being raised. Inflation is increasing at a rate that it has never had before, and Cubans spend hours a day waiting in lines for food and gas. If the prices are raised, then the people living in Cuba cannot afford to take care of themselves. And on the other hand, when tourists visit, they use and buy more goods that should be left for people living in Cuba. We even found ourselves doing it. We had to be reminded that we can access these things much easier where we live, and if tourists continue to buy these products, there will be nothing for Cuban people to buy. A common saying when referring to Cuba is for people to say, "Go now before it changes," referring to the rapidly changing culture. Just for the sake of souvenirs, Cuban culture is overly played on and stereotyped, and things like cigars become the national mascot, rather than people trying to actually learn about Cuba. Just from visiting Cuba, we saw the same souvenirs over and over, showing that Cuban culture is beginning to erase itself, all to please tourists. When asked why people visit Cuba, many responded with its nature. But with each visitor swimming in Cuban waters and visiting mountains, that means more effect on the environment. Coral reefs are becoming greatly endangered due to people constantly being on the shoreline.
Around 30% of Cuba's population comprises Afro-Cubans, including mulattoes and mestizos. This racial diversity stems from the Atlantic slave trade, which persisted in Cuba from the early 16th century until the 19th century. As a result, Cuban culture exhibits a significant presence of Afro elements and traditions, resulting in a new fusion identity. For instance, Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean religion deeply embedded in Cuban culture, combines elements of Catholicism with Yoruban beliefs and traditions. Moreover, Cuban food features ingredients such as okra, yam, and plantain, which all have African origins. Cuban musical genres such as rumba, conga, salsa, and son cubano all owe their existence to African instruments such as the bata, iesa, and bembe drums. As a result of the historical impact of the slave trade, Cuban culture is a mix of both African and European elements. However, beneath the surface of cultural harmony, racial disparities continue to persist in Cuba. Afro-Cubans face systemic discrimination, which affects their access to education, employment, opportunities, and housing. Colorism and racism persist, particularly in the tourism industry. Within Cuba's tourism landscape, racial stereotypes are perpetrated through the portrayal of Afro-Cubans in souvenir shops, where black women are often depicted in demeaning roles. The tourism industry often perpetrates narrow beauty standards and marginalize black women.
Be about tourism in Cuba, and I know you were talking about earlier about the portrayal of black people, specifically black women, in the tourist industry. If you could expand on that and give more thoughts about that.
See, I think that the tour industry in Cuba, they have one part of the market that have excellent products like artist products, but also they have another images that I don't like. I think that they are not necessary, and it's especially the images about the representation of black women because it's a stereotype. And in Cuba we have women with a lot of social, political, and educational level and historical level, and I think that we don't need this kind of images. It's a little sad because also it's not a representation of the Cuban women. It's a stereotype.
Despite the adversity, Afro-Cuban women are reclaiming their narratives and reshaping the industry. We met inspiring women community leaders such as Gloria during our time in Cuba that are challenging stereotypes, creating opportunities, and empowering black women to take control of their destinies. It has hindered the country's ability to export goods and services to the United States, a significant market that could have potentially boosted Cuba's economy. The trade restrictions have also limited Cuba's access to U.S. agricultural products, making it harder for the country to meet its nutrition needs. The limited access to trade has also hindered Cuba's ability to advance its technology, transportation, and energy sectors, as can be seen in the old-fashioned designs of the cars in Cuba. As a result of the U.S. embargo, Cuba has faced economic hardships, limited foreign investment, and reduced access to technology, resources, and markets. Without access to such foreign markets, Cuba's economy has become mainly relying on its tourism industry.
My name is Sara Daisy Herrera Gonzalez.
My name is Gloria Victoria Rolando Casamayor. I am Cuba. It was both
civilians' lives in Cuba.
For some people, it's good. I mean, it's good. It's okay because first opening, you can learn from other cultures. You can socialize. You can practice your language. If you speak in language, I'm talking about German, French, etc. Also, some negative things are associated to tourist industry, like prostitution, example, like people trying to introduce some drugs in their guts, example. So, but in general, it's good for the country. It's good. It's good for the economy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That'll be it.
Create private businesses. There are also businesses that develop an activity specifically addressed to the touristic sector, right? And then also, these people will also have like an income in foreign currency directly that will have an improvement for them in their business, but also in their personal lives that other people won't have.
It's a stereotype, and even it's a copy of the minstrel that came to Cuba at the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with red leaves, it's an interpretation that tried to create a ridiculous atmosphere around black people. So I think that it doesn't make any sense.
Thank you.
Tourism in Cuba is unlike tourism in other countries. Cuba's tourism industry stands apart from other nations due to its unique dependence on the sector for economic stability. Unlike many countries where tourism serves as a supplementary source of income, Cuba relies heavily on tourism as one of the main components of its economy. With the decline of other key industries such as sugar production and Soviet support during the 20th century, tourism became one of Cuba's main and leading industries, causing it to become dependent on it for its economic growth and income.
Now, the other one is the difference that it creates among people, because then you will have people who will be working in the tourist sector that will have direct access to foreign currency, right? And then you will have other people who cannot work there or do not wish to work there because they have other interests, professionally speaking, but they won't have access to that foreign currency. So people with this possibility on working in tourism will have an improvement in their lifestyle other people won't have. So you will be, or we have already, so differences in the quality of life, different people. That's another impact. Also, now with the opening of more options to create private businesses, there are also businesses that develop an activity specifically addressed to the touristic sector, right? And then also, these people will also have like an income in foreign currency directly that will have an improvement for them in their business, but also in their personal lives that other people won't have. So the struggle now is...
While Cuba's history has evidently shown that sugar was a great source of income, it is important to note that things have made a dramatic shift that has already made a huge impact on Cuban society. From affecting relations with other countries, to causing social cleavages and affecting race relations, and to affecting the nature and culture of Cuba, tourism has done more than just affect the economy. For the future, Cuba's main goal is to increase tourism because it has become a large impact on the economy and especially important to the recovery of the economy since the COVID pandemic. In May of 2022, Biden decreased restrictions on travel to Cuba, allowing for more travel to Cuba from the U.S. The Cuban government hopes for more tourism because of this and encourages it by building more hotels. However, many are not in support of the construction of these hotels. People don't like that homes and buildings are being knocked down for these new pretty hotels that are to attract tourists. The biggest issue, though, is that money is being spent on buildings for people who don't live in Cuba, yet places like homes and schools are not getting nearly the amount of attention. Overall, the Cuban government has become dependent on tourists. However, that means the quality of life of those living in Cuba may be affected. Cuba has grown from a sugar economy to relying heavily on people who travel. While it is important that we continue to visit Cuba to support their economy, especially with blockades still set against them, it is also important that we ensure that the Cuban people are being taken care of. To do this, while still allowing for the Cuban economy to prosper, eat locally, lodge at local bed and breakfasts, all to ensure that people are being supported.